Uh, Hello everyone, I'm Marsha Fernando, a second year graduate at the Department of International Relations at the University of Colombo. So my question is actually related to the question asked previously. So when we look at the Bandung conference and mainly at the international order at that time, one particular salient feature that I can see is the moral power in the global south. We actually were very united with each other in a time span where proxy wars were going on and there was a clear-cut division between two blocks in the world. So in that essence, we had this moral power where we were there for each other in proxy war situations and maybe economic collapses. So my question is, we can use that kind of international moral power. So we have many modes of power with soft power and hard power, but this special aspect of moral power can be used to come out of our issues with dollarization and de-dollarization as well. Because although we have focused on political aspects, particularly in the Bandung conference, the frameworks can be used up to date to contribute to the economic issues that we have. So at a moral ground, we can unite. So what can we do in that sense? So how can we develop from that aspect, taking examples from the Bandung conference in particular?
Thank you. To some extent, this is the best of times and the worst of times because it's the best of times because the US is demonstrating such chaos in leadership that mirage has, I think, been against mirage or the mania has been undermined. But it's also the worst of time because the other countries have not used this to have any kind of solidarity to negotiate together. They have not used this. Each one has gone separately to get a little deal for themselves. But if we stood back and thought, how can they negotiate as a bloc? Not just China because it's big or India because it's big. And rather than doing it independently, this could have been an opportunity. And we are missing that. And I don't know that that can be reignited.
Thank you. One more question from the back and then we come back.
I think I want to pose this question to Dr. Bruno. My name is Dileepa. I'm a rights activist as well as advocate for education reform, particularly decolonizing education. My question is inspired by what you said about International Division of Labor and the link in the global south to the brain drain. Because many countries, including Sri Lanka is suffering a lot from this as we speak, where our public education system produces high-skilled professionals, and then many of them leave the country to the global north. So then this idea of international division of labor doesn't really work in the sense because it doesn't benefit the global south at all. We seem to be producing professionals that eventually migrate to the global north, and then therefore we are not benefiting from what we spend money on. So what should we do about it? That's my question.
Thank you. Let's take those 4 questions. Is there anybody? Okay, all right. Dr. Faldo, would you like to answer any of those questions? Are we okay? The technology there? Okay? All right. You can ask, we had 4 questions. One was about, yes, we have to unlearn certain things. So what do we replace that with, right? What do we learn? There was a question about the moral power.
is that this issue of brain gain is proposed also on brain gain. And so it's a brain drain and a brain gain movement. But as I mentioned earlier, there is no recognition of the contribution of the global south in the general knowledge. And if we have this system of debunking how knowledge is built in the world system, and if we consider that all the youths have the right to move anywhere they want to be, at least in the global south, if the North doesn't accept, we can allow circulation of knowledge, at least in the global south, if we have another conception of morality. Because this issue of morality, this issue of ethics, normally most of mankind have invented religions because in fact our ethics are weak. But if we accept that we can have a system of morality that is universal, that's why I was referring to understanding the origin and the homeomorphic examples of other conceptions of worldview elsewhere. If we can reconcile that, then we can build a new form of universalist system. And this is based on ethics and moral, but it needs to be the contribution also of the global south. The idea of liberty, you have not chosen to be born, and so liberty, you haven't chosen to die. Those are, freedom is something that is restricted, but idea of equality is something more interesting. So if we put this at the cornerstone of our struggle, if we put solidarity, we can achieve those type of those progress. Now it may sound very utopian for you, for the youth, and as Dr. Su have explained, those consensual 10 principles that was raised in Bandung in 55 seems mild compared to what we are facing today. Just for the issue of defending the commons, all the public goods, just the issue of defending the earth that is in danger. And you remember how it was during the pandemic, where we really see that we were lacking morals and ethics in terms of defending global health. So basically what I'm just saying is that all those concepts are useless if we don't actually understand the progressive potential that is still lying into the spirit of this Bandung efforts. But that's why I was saying that it has lost its breath, and I'm calling for another stage, which I call Bandung second, or trans-internationalism, where we can reinvent and like it's a fresh page. I'm just coming from Argentina, and I was struck there that most of the elites are still considering themselves as Europeans, and they look with despite to the other Latin America. While in fact, if you remember when they were fighting against Britain for the Falkland, so-called Malwins, the whole South was with them. So instead of accepting the geographical but also historic grounding in the South, they look themselves are one of the United States provinces. So this is where we have to re-educate, I think, our system of thought, and I trust the new generation, the young generation, accept to be planet citizens, and particularly accept their participation in a global South endeavor. And this is something that we can learn, we Africans can learn from Sri Lanka, from Vietnam, from Brazil, and exchange knowledge. For example, we can defend biodiversity. In my region, for example, we have 3,000 plants, at least 600 have been already patented by multinationals like Pfizer and Coca-Cola, etc. Those are common goods that we need to defend. So anyway, I think we have a great deal to learn. We have to learn from China. We have to learn from internationalists like Norman Mitchell, who's a Canadian who went there during the Spanish War and then went to China. So those are the spirits that are still alive with the idea of ethics. And I do believe that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just need to know history and know exactly where we go. There is no, maybe no communal, there is no way as such, but the horizon should not be closed for the new generation. And this is where we are very anxious with this new technology that the youth don't necessarily have the capacity of recognizing what is left from right in the internet, for example. What is disinformation and information? What type of skills that you need to have to be able to be armed with science? Because science is the only option, a progressive science with open mind and critical understanding of reality and history.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting questions. And then I will start with the one related to solidarity, because it's very true that in situations of crisis, we can have a push for solidarity, but we can also have a push for nationalism, right? And this is what is happening in many countries in the world, including my country, Brazil, which had Bolsonaro, it was a nightmare. But I do believe that we have a very strong push for solidarity, and I'll tell you why. We had, with the pandemic, unveiled the total failure, and there is no other word for that, of the global governance, right? When it's the scandal of the distribution of vaccination, for instance, it's a total failure of the global governance. And so it shows the need to reform, and what I would say is that so these acts of inequality is one of the axes which is very critical nowadays and which cannot be faced nationally, and the other one is the ecological crisis, right? The ecological crisis by definition cannot be dealt with nationally. So either we face it collectively or we will perish collectively. So I would say that we have to, I don't know what will happen, maybe nationalism will prevail, maybe a war will prevail, but we as militants, I would say that we have to stick to these two axes, facing inequality and facing the ecological crisis as the core of the need for solidarity. When, coming back to the brain drain and the immigration, when Europeans talk about immigration crisis, or when the US talk about immigration crisis, it's a total, it's totally misconception to analyze it, in my opinion, because it's not an immigration crisis, it's a crisis of inequality, and that, as you said, it's obviously that with the current inequalities we have, people, young generations, will want to go abroad to other countries, right? So to deal with this multi-dimensional crisis, we have to, in my opinion, go into the core of it, which is related to inequality and to the ecological crisis, which both combined create the humanitarian crisis we are living. And so this is why I believe that in spite of all problems and nationalism movements we have in the world, we can try to get united and change the situation.
Thank you for the very important questions. So the first one was on alternatives to the liberal order, the second one was on morality, and the third was on the ability to negotiate as a bloc. And in a way, all three questions are about the system of capitalism that we all operate under. And Thomas Sankara has a very, very good quote on this, which is that you cannot fight a system without another system, and you can't rely on people's goodwill. So basically, in terms of morality, what we're arguing is that the system of capitalism is not delivering for the majority of the world. I mean, right now it's only delivering for the 1%, and that is why we have all these cascading problems. So instead of focusing just purely on moral grounds, I think we have to address the problem from a structural ground, which is related to the structure of capitalism in its entirety. And the second is on alternatives. And I mean, there are so many things, even how we understand economics, for example. The emphasis for every economy right now is on productivity. And nobody has been able to map what the term productivity actually means. How do you make something productive is by increasing someone's exploitation. And the larger the exploitation, the higher the productivity or the profit. So if in this instance this one metric is transformed to include well-being, to include longevity, this is just a simple example. in terms of the ability to negotiate as a bloc, once again, I think we're constantly in a state where we have to, our interests are against each other, and there's a concerted push every time to focus on divide and rule, as you saw in the latest episode in the subcontinent with India and Pakistan. And I think this happens because there is so much economic insecurity. And under capitalism, this violence has no end. So I think unless states rethink the model that they're currently practicing, I think unless that's the focal point, all these problems will continue as they are. Thanks.
I would echo what said from the three speakers here. Let me just add one small thing. As probably many people have read something about Marxism, Marxists would know this expression. Sometimes 20 years is one day, and sometimes one day is 20 years. And the history changes in sometimes unpredictable terms, I would say such progress, such advance, probably is closer to us when the dominant economic system is collapsing today. I think in practical terms, all the nations, large or small, have to protect themselves from the fallout of the collapse of U.S. imperialism. Well, not entirely collapse, but it's declining. And with the decline, the West is creating all kinds of damages to people all around the world. And so in practical terms, that how do we protect people from that kind of damage? And that will require strengthening a certain level of the national character of the capital in each country. In other words, if neoliberalism, if globalization, for most of the time, require a submission of national character to some kind of global division of labor, then we have to totally revoke that international division of labor. We have to protect our own national industries. We have to develop our national industries. And to that effect, there's like this particular social class, the social class that has been closely related to this international division of labor, which we call it the compradors. The compradors have to be weakened significantly in whatever ways. And with that weakening of the compradors worldwide in the global south, and I think a lot of progressive political space can be opened up in that process. That doesn't have to. We don't necessarily have to aim for A, B, and C. From the socialist textbooks, but we can start from small things. All the things that the other speakers have mentioned: protecting our children, protecting our family, protecting the earth, protecting a lot of things, and we can start from there. Thank you.
Very quickly, two quick points. The first one is on this being the best of times and can we get solidarity. One of the problems with the embrace of neoliberalism, because of the fact that you couldn't generate independent national development strategies, which was a promise at the time in Bandung was said, is that it results in a situation where countries compete with each other to get a foothold in external markets. You don't develop your own market, so you need a foothold in external markets. So you suppress your wages domestically to become competitive. You try to compete with others in order to occupy this available space in global markets to the extent that it's open for you. And therefore, you're constantly in a world of divide. So in some sense, we can't take the issue of solidarity out of the economic context in which it is embedded, which in part the Bandung Declaration did. If we actually locate it within the economic context, then we have to say that unless you have strategies pursued which gives national independence, and independent sovereign governments come together to stand up against imperialism, you you actually would find it difficult to build substantial South-South solidarity, which answers partly the question, so what is the alternative? The first, of course, is we must build our national markets in order to be able to have some kind of illegal development. In smaller countries, we have to do it by having a sort of common market across countries, for which we need South-South solidarity. To do that, we need to address economic and asset inequality. To address asset inequality, you're basically saying that you not only need progressive fiscal policies, tax and redistribution measures, but you also need a direct attack on forms of monopoly which you think undermine progress and growth. And till such time as you can achieve it, the least we can do is to guarantee to our people universal access to food, to education, to health. There must be some minimums, including, of course, some degree of social protection in the case of old age and disability. At least that much we must guarantee today as we fight to actually ensure that we can have national development which allows the South-South solidarity.
Thank you. I think we are actually out of time, but I will take 2 questions, maybe just one from me and right someone got right.
Yeah.
That's the woman with bright red earrings. That's the next one. And then we'll take one from this side. Okay. So 3 questions.
Yeah, my question is like when we are talking about new Bandung spirits, or like we are talking about new NAM, so how we can like go for like grassroots driven kind of people-centric initiative for this aspect, like because we know like the current world order is like very dynamic and it's increasing multipolar system, and also the some powers like who are in the world, like they are also considering as global south. So within that context, like how we can like separate these aspects and how we can like construct a new structure or something if we are going forward in this part.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers for really thought-provoking presentations. I wanted to ask Professor Chandrasekhar about a comment, and I'm sorry if I've misinterpreted what you said or if I'm reducing your analysis. But you mentioned that one of the reasons why the Bandung movement didn't have a linear development where it transformed the world order was possibly because the state didn't emerge as a bulwark for capitalism, a state which has the people's interests at its core. As Sri Lankans are also finding out after the last election, isn't that a rather overly positive view of the liberal state right now? Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gevidu. I'm a law student from the University of Colombo. My question to the panel is, especially in the modern context, with a lot of conflicts around the world, do you think that there is sort of a possibility of world leaders coming onto one single desk and discussing a policy for the entire globe? Let's say South-South nations at the moment, if we look at the Pakistan conflict and then the Israel-Palestine conflict, we've seen a lot of countries being divided in opinion. So in that sort of context, would it be possible for countries to come to a single desk and discuss these issues that are very much important to us at the moment? And also, in line with this, how do you see the global order changing if there is sort of room for the non-aligned movement to, let's say, re-emerge in this current context? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the panel, and then start from Professor Chandrasekhar on this end, but just to say, answer the questions, and then maybe if you have a final remark that you think has not been address, just to make that as well.
Okay, yeah, you didn't overly misrepresent me at all, so that's great. But let me explain. So I'm not saying that if actually the people, because of the fact that they experience distress, a crisis, etc., put in place a state, that state would automatically necessarily be of a kind that will, I mean, we know what happened in Greece, for example. And people voted to put Syriza in power. It had a very clear mandate to do certain things. The finance minister quit, Yanis Varoufakis, because of the fact that Syriza wouldn't do what it promised its people that it would do. So now the thing is, there are two ways we can interpret it. One, of course, we have to recognize that sometimes these states come to power in the context of a legacy of subordination which makes them vulnerable. So if you have a large amount of foreign capital accumulated in your stock markets, for example, or your bond markets, you're worried that if you do something, there will be a flight of capital. Now the point is to therefore build over a period of time an ability to be able to address that flight or the consequences of that flight, and also have the social sanction to get people to agree that there would be a period in which they have to take a sacrifice in order for you to be able to reshape the agenda the way they want you to reshape. So there is an international context. There is an imperialism. We can't write that off, which actually constrains even progressive states which are voted to power. But the other is that we shouldn't take only one or two examples. I've given an extreme example, but we know examples in Latin America. We know examples where there have been governments which have come and have gone part of the way. And as he said, things don't necessarily happen in one day. But the point is, in the process of trying to do what you should do, you actually then mobilize a set of forces which can actually give material form and substance to these ideas which are transformative. And that's what we're looking for. And that's the only thing we can constantly try and do, is to keep hoping that in this process of moving forward step by step, you would actually bring the transformation needed to get yourself not merely a more egalitarian order, but solidarity which undermines imperialism and all that.
I didn't really have much to add to what Professor Chandrasekhar said, but I just mentioned one thing, that if imperialism serves as a major external constraint for whatever progressive policies that we can do in the global south, that constraint, I think, is in the process of weakening. As we all mentioned about this. So I think we can be a little bit more optimistic looking forward that in 10 years, in 20 years, that we would be in a very different kind of global situation where a lot of unimaginable policies, unimaginable actions will become viable, feasible, something quite likely to happen.
Thank you. I also don't have much to add because Professor's already mentioned that, but just on the point on possibilities, the reason why I was mentioning militancy is because it is ultimately the last resort. People use their bodies because they don't have any other means of doing so. And when they do that in a generational cycle, I think it becomes something much bigger and larger as we see in those coalitions. And therefore we must also always account for this struggle. The Vietnam War lasted for 40 years, and the US could not stand up to ordinary Vietnamese. And this is something we must always remember when we speak of possibilities.
Very good questions again, but obviously I'd like only to touch some issues related to the grassroots movements. Actually, in my exposition and in many analyses here, we are trying to use this divide between global north and global south, which is very useful in my opinion, because there is an exploitation from the global south done by the global north, obviously. But we have to go into, and it was mentioned as well, at the end of the day, we have also always to discuss the social struggles which happen in each country, right? So obviously, in my country, Brazil, in many peripheral countries, there is an addict, which also takes benefit, for instance, of the International Division of Finance. So they are in favor of delaying Argentina with the dollarization that's why it cannot be done, real transformations cannot be done without grassroots movements in each of those countries, both in those north and south delivery. And then if you can have a global policy, well, it's a very good question, but the answer is that it would be the ideal situation, but it's very, very hard, right? And when we are living this humanitarian crisis, and then the solution to the humanitarian crisis, which is provided by the global north, for the ecological crisis, for instance, in some cases, it's a total shame, right? When they say that the solution for the climate change is electric vehicle, it's a joke. I mean, they are trying to get less pollution in Europe or the US, but with pollution and mining in Africa or in Latin America, right? So, so if we do not agree on a global policy, and it's very unlikely we will do it, it shows even more the need to have at least a kind of a consensus in the global south, right? And then regional alliances are very important, and if we cannot have the whole global south having more and more countries involved in these movements for concrete transformations, is already.
Well, yes, quickly on this global governance issue and people-centric. As you know, the multilateral system was not working because those who built it no longer need it, as it was built as a reproduction system of the world governance system. The non-aligned movement actually led to the advent of the Group of 77 in a truncated multilateral system. And the response was international cooperation, which never reached the 0.7 of ODA. So they tried it, United States and Japan, mainly in Europe, never really respect that. And their response was to create the G3, then the G5, then the G7, then the G8, and finally G20. The G20 is attempting to regulate the international order without having authority to do so. Many civil societies are processing. Civil societies, just to show you how it's important to repoliticize our masses. Civil societies organize an anti-imperialist people's court, like during the November 2024 G20 activity. It was called the Popular Anti-Imperialist Tribunal, which brought together thousands of people at the Foundation Progreso, which is a historic place in Rio de Janeiro, to judge 6 cases among them Palestine, Haiti, the United States-Mercosur agreement of crimes in the presence of those who affected lawyers and judges. So in fact, all the peoples and nations that have suffered colonization and continue to suffer its after effects must learn to work together to emerge from their condition. And this is why the people-centric approach is so important. To not leave the decision-making to leaders. There was a World Summit, maybe you have witnessed the World Summit that was called by UN to see whether the leader of the world would be able to save mankind. And it was a failure. So it is important that citizens, not consumers, but citizens, with consciousness, like understanding what is the gravity of the situation and the emergency. And this is why the anti-systemic zone, which is this global south, have the privilege to express this capacity of South-South cooperation at all levels, bilateral, multilateral, or simply as citizens. And this is why we should never underestimate the scope and the magnitude of any of our contribution. Like even the tiny person, like the drop of rain or any drop in the sea. All people are important. And even though it is not considered as important people in the global north, you can see when we have casualties in Palestine or people dying in the global south, no one really pays attention. I'm not mentioning Africa. But we know that we are all important. And once we understand that and that united we can really confront the system, once we realize that, I think it's almost impossible to stop the tide. because they know exactly the power of the people when people unite, imperialism tremble.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really good note on which to end. It brings back also another concept that I think was prevalent during that time of Bandung, which is the whole idea of conscientization of citizens. So I think that's really a really important aspect. Tomorrow you will be able to kind of have panels that look into some of these questions more deeply. So we have a panel on crisis planning and industrial policy. We have a panel on decolonization, the Bandung spirit, and the new international economic order, and we have a final panel on new multilateralism, South-South solidarity, and alternatives. So if you couldn't answer